Daddy, don't throw her away. 8-year-old Lily Whitmore said it so quietly that her father almost missed it beneath the soft clatter of silverware and the low hum of conversation around them. Ethan Whitmore stopped with the napkin halfway to the trash. Throw what away? Her. Lily pointed across the restaurant. The waitress. Ethan looked over. Grace Miller stood beneath the warm amber lights, balancing 3 plates on one hand while quietly helping an elderly couple find their table. She wore a simple navy blouse, black slacks, and a small silver watch with a scratched face. Nothing about her suggested wealth, influence, or importance. She was simply a waitress doing her best to make a long Friday night easier for strangers. Lily, Ethan said gently, we don't keep every napkin we draw on. I know. Then why this one? Lily looked down at the little picture between them. Ethan had expected a child's ordinary sketch, something temporary and sweet. Instead, Lily had drawn Grace with startling care. Her loose brown hair, the small smile at the corner of her mouth, even the tiny silver watch on her wrist. Beside Grace stood a little girl. And beside that girl stood a tall man in a dark coat. Ethan's breath caught. Who's the man? He asked. Lily shrugged. You. And the girl. Me. Ethan stared at the napkin. 3 figures. A waitress. A father. A daughter. Somehow, Lily had placed them together as naturally as if they already belonged in the same family photograph. Why did you draw us with her? Ethan asked. Lily's pencil hovered over the paper. Because she looks lonely. That answer should have ended the conversation. Instead, it stayed with Ethan. He had spent years surrounded by people who knew exactly who he was. Billionaire. Founder. Investor. Widower. Father. Every room changed when Ethan Whitmore entered it. People straightened. Voices softened. Phones appeared. Smiles became careful. Grace had done none of that. She had not looked twice at his tailored coat, his expensive watch, or the black SUV waiting outside. She had simply noticed Lily struggling to reach the cherry bowl and had slid it closer without being asked. A small thing. Quiet. Kindness. The kind of thing money could never command. Daddy, Lily whispered. What? Can I give it to her? Ethan looked at Grace again. She was standing near the kitchen entrance now, rubbing one tired wrist before returning to work. For just a second, their eyes met. Grace offered a polite smile. Ethan nodded back. Then Lily reached for the napkin. No, Ethan said. Let me keep it. Lily blinked. Why? Ethan folded the paper carefully, once, then twice. I don't know. And that was the truth. He did not know why his fingers suddenly felt protective around something worth less than $1. He did not know why Lily's drawing made the restaurant seem strangely quiet. He did not know why the woman across the room had become impossible to ignore. He only knew that after losing Lily's mother, he had learned to hold tightly to anything that reminded him of home. Ethan slipped the napkin into his wallet. He thought he was keeping a child's drawing. He had no idea he was keeping the first clue to a memory his daughter had buried, and a woman her mother had once trusted. The next morning, Lily asked the question Ethan had been trying not to think about. Are we going back to the restaurant? Ethan looked up from his coffee. Why? Because Grace works there. Ethan set his cup down. You remembered her name. Lily nodded as if that were obvious. She told me. When? Last night. Ethan stared at his daughter for a moment. He had been sitting across from her for 8 years, yet sometimes Lily still surprised him with the things she noticed. We are not going back just because you drew a picture of someone, he said. Lily lowered her eyes. I did not say because of the picture. That quiet answer landed harder than Ethan expected. By 6 that evening, they were back at the same restaurant. Ethan told himself it was because Lily wanted dinner. He ignored the fact that he had spent most of the afternoon wondering about the woman in the navy blouse. Grace was working the same section. When she saw Lily enter, her expression softened immediately. Well, look who came back. Lily smiled. I told my daddy you would remember me. Grace glanced at Ethan. She was right. Ethan gave a polite nod. She remembers everyone. Not everyone, Lily said. Grace smiled, but Ethan noticed something strange. She did not ask what he wanted to drink. She did not comment on his expensive watch. She did not seem interested in impressing him. Instead, she crouched beside Lily and asked, How was school? Lily began talking immediately. Ethan listened as his daughter described a science project, a spelling test, and a classmate who had brought a turtle to school. Grace listened to every word. Not the distracted listening of someone waiting for a customer to finish speaking, but the patient kind that made a child feel important. Then Grace noticed the folded napkin in Ethan's wallet when he reached for his credit card. Her eyes paused. Is that the drawing? Ethan closed the wallet. You remember it? It was hard to miss. Lily drew it. Grace looked at the little girl. You are quite the artist. Lily shook her head. I only draw people when they matter. Grace went still. Ethan noticed it immediately. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. Then Grace smiled again. That is a very serious rule. Lily nodded. I have another one. What is it? Grace asked. Lily leaned closer and whispered something Ethan could not hear. Grace's smile disappeared. Her eyes moved toward Ethan, then back to Lily. What did you say? Ethan asked. Lily looked confused. I asked if she knew Mommy. The restaurant suddenly seemed louder. A glass touched a table somewhere behind them. Silverware clinked. Someone laughed near the bar. Ethan heard every sound except his own breathing. Grace slowly stood. Lily, she said softly, why would you ask me that? Because you look like her. Ethan's expression changed. Grace glanced at him, and for the first time since they had met, she looked genuinely unsettled. I do not know what you mean. Ethan's voice remained calm. My wife had brown hair. She wore a silver watch. Grace instinctively touched her wrist. The same scratched silver watch Lily had drawn. Ethan noticed. Grace noticed him noticing. And suddenly the napkin inside his wallet no longer felt like a child's innocent drawing. It felt like a question neither of them was ready to answer. Grace touched the silver watch on her wrist and slowly lowered her hand. I think there has been a misunderstanding, she said. Ethan studied her face. Then help me understand. Ethan, Grace whispered, and the sound of his first name made him pause. He had never told her his name. Not once. Lily looked from one adult to the other, sensing something had changed. Grace seemed to realize her mistake. Your daughter said it last night, she added quickly. Ethan did not answer. He remembered the first evening clearly. Lily had called him Daddy all night. Grace had never heard his name from him. Yet she had said it naturally, as though it belonged somewhere in her memory. Ethan leaned back in his chair. How do you know my name? Grace looked toward the kitchen. I heard someone say it. Who? I do not remember. The answer was too quick. Too careful. Lily reached across the table and touched Grace's hand. You knew Mommy, did you not? Grace looked down at the little fingers resting against hers. Something softened in her expression, but sadness followed. Your mother was a very kind woman. Ethan felt his chest tighten. Grace had answered the question without actually answering it. What was her name, he asked. Grace looked at him. Emily. Ethan went still. Only a handful of people outside his family knew that his wife had always hated being called by her formal name. She had introduced herself as Emily everywhere, even though her legal name was Amelia. Grace had just used the name Ethan knew, the name that belonged to his memories, not public records. How did you know that, he asked. Grace stood quietly beside the table. I knew someone named Emily. My wife. Grace did not respond. Lily looked up at her. You knew her. Grace closed her eyes for a moment. Yes. One word. Soft. Simple. But it changed everything. Ethan looked at the waitress differently now. The tired woman in a navy blouse was no longer a stranger who had been kind to his daughter. She was someone who had known Emily before the illness, before the hospital, before the quiet house and the empty bedroom. Someone who might know a part of his wife that Ethan had never seen. How, he asked. Grace looked toward Lily. Not here. Ethan's voice became quieter. Why not? Because your daughter should not have to hear this in the middle of a restaurant. That answer struck Ethan harder than anything else she had said. Grace was not avoiding him. She was protecting Lily. Ethan glanced at his daughter. Lily was watching Grace with complete trust. Then when? He asked. Grace hesitated. After my shift. Ethan nodded. We will wait. Grace returned to work, but she moved differently now, distracted by something only she understood. Lily watched her walk away. Then she leaned toward her father. Daddy. Yes. She is the lady Mommy told me about. Ethan turned slowly. His heart seemed to stop on that sentence. What did you say? Lily frowned, as though she could not understand why he was surprised. Mommy told me about Grace. Ethan stared at his daughter. Lily reached for the folded napkin inside his wallet. That is why I drew her. Ethan pulled the napkin out and unfolded it beneath the warm restaurant lights. The little picture suddenly looked different. The waitress, the child, the father, and the woman standing just outside the drawing, barely visible near the edge. Emily. Ethan had never noticed her before. Where did you know my wife from? Ethan asked the moment Grace returned to their table. Grace looked at Lily, then at the folded napkin in Ethan's hand. Not here, she said. Then tell me somewhere else. Your daughter is listening. She deserves the truth. Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded toward the restaurant entrance. There is a small cafe 2 doors down. Give me 10 minutes. Ethan did not like waiting, but Lily was already reaching for her coat. 10 minutes later, the 3 of them sat in a quiet corner of the cafe, where rain tapped softly against the windows and the smell of fresh coffee filled the room. Grace kept both hands around a warm mug she had barely touched. Ethan sat across from her, his expression controlled, but his thoughts were moving faster than he wanted to admit. I met Emily 6 years ago, Grace began. Before she became sick? Ethan asked. Grace nodded. Before anyone knew how serious things were. Ethan lowered his eyes. 6 years ago. That was before Emily's diagnosis. Before the hospital visits. Before Lily had begun asking why her mother was always tired. Where, he asked. At a community center in downtown Chicago. Ethan frowned. Emily never told me she volunteered there. She did not tell many people. Grace gave a faint smile. That was one of the things I liked about her. She helped people quietly. She never needed anyone to know. Ethan stared at the table. That sounded exactly like Emily. She had once spent an entire Saturday helping a neighbor organize donated clothes and never mentioned it afterward. What did you do there, he asked. I volunteered too. Mostly after school programs and family events. Grace looked toward Lily. Your mother was especially good with children. Lily smiled. I know. Grace smiled back, but her expression changed when she looked at the little girl. She talked about you constantly. Ethan's eyes lifted. About Lily? Every time. What did she say? Grace hesitated. That you were the center of her world. Ethan swallowed. He had heard those words before, but hearing them from a stranger who had known Emily made them feel different. More real. More painful. Then why did I never hear your name? He asked. Grace's fingers tightened slightly around the mug. Because Emily asked me not to tell you. Ethan leaned forward. Why? Grace looked directly at him. She said you would misunderstand. Silence settled between them. Ethan had built companies worth billions of dollars, negotiated with people who measured every sentence for advantage, and learned to recognize when someone was hiding something. But Grace did not look calculating. She looked tired, sad, almost afraid of disappointing a woman who was no longer there to hear her. What did she ask you to do? Ethan asked. Grace looked at Lily again. I promised I would only tell you if Lily remembered me. Ethan's face changed. Remembered you? Grace nodded. Your daughter came to the community center once. She was very young. Emily brought her because she needed somewhere safe to spend the afternoon. Lily stared at Grace. I remember. A red door, she whispered. Grace's eyes widened. Yes. And Mommy gave me crayons. Grace slowly nodded. You drew a picture. Lily looked at her father. I drew you. Ethan felt the room become strangely distant. Grace reached into her purse and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It showed a younger Emily standing beside Lily, smiling beneath a red door. Beside them stood a young Grace, holding a stack of children's drawings. Ethan stared at the photograph. Then Grace whispered, Your wife left something for you, Ethan. I have kept it for 6 years. What did Emily leave for me? Ethan asked. Grace looked at the photograph in her hands, then at Lily, as though measuring how much truth a child could carry in one evening. Not everything belongs to tonight. You said she left something. She did. Then please give it to me. Grace was quiet. The cafe had nearly emptied. Outside, rain traced thin silver lines down the glass, while the coffee machine clicked softly behind the counter. Ethan could hear Lily turning the edge of the old photograph between her fingers. Grace finally reached into her purse and pulled out a small cream-colored envelope. It was worn at the corners, softened by years of being handled, but the handwriting across the front was unmistakable. Ethan knew it before he read his name. Emily. His fingers stopped above the paper. She wrote this? He whispered. Yes. When? Grace lowered her eyes. A few weeks before she passed away. The words seemed to settle over the table like dust. Ethan did not open the envelope. He simply held it. 6 years of questions lived inside something thinner than a greeting card. Why had Emily never told him about Grace? Why had she trusted a stranger with something meant for him? Why had Grace waited all this time? Lily leaned closer. Is it from Mommy? Ethan nodded. Lily smiled, but Grace looked uneasy. There is something you should know first. Ethan looked up. What? Your wife asked me to wait until Lily remembered the red door. Ethan glanced at his daughter. Why would that matter? Grace took a slow breath. Because Emily believed Lily would forget the details, but not the feeling. She said, children sometimes hold on to kindness longer than adults hold on to facts. Ethan looked down at the drawing. The little red door Lily had mentioned was not in his memory. Neither was the community center. Neither was Grace. Yet Emily had somehow built a small hidden world around them without ever telling him. Why did she not tell me? Ethan asked. Grace answered softly. Maybe because you were trying so hard to protect everyone. Ethan's expression tightened. From what? From losing her. That sentence left him still. Grace did not look away. Emily told me you stopped talking about the future after her diagnosis. She said you became very good at taking care of Lily, but not very good at letting yourself feel anything. Ethan swallowed. He wanted to reject it. He wanted to say Emily had been wrong. But the quiet house, the untouched chair at the kitchen table, the boxes he had never opened, all rose in his mind at once. Grace slid the envelope across the table. She also told me something else. Ethan looked at her. What? If you ever came back to the place where you first met me, I was supposed to give you this. Ethan frowned. I never met you before last week. Grace's eyes moved to Lily. You did. You just do not remember. Lily suddenly sat straighter. Daddy. Ethan turned. What? She pointed at the photograph. That is the red door. Ethan looked down. The picture showed Emily beside a younger Lily, standing beneath a faded red entrance. Grace was beside them, holding a stack of drawings. But in the corner of the photograph, barely visible through the open doorway, stood a man in a dark coat. Ethan stared at the shape. Something stirred in his memory. A rainy afternoon. Emily laughing. Lily holding a purple crayon. A promise he could not quite hear. Then Grace whispered, That man is you. I was there. Ethan whispered. Grace nodded. You were. Ethan stared at the photograph again, trying to force the memory into focus. The man in the picture wore the same dark coat Ethan remembered owning years ago, but his face was turned slightly away from the camera. Why can I not remember this? He asked. Grace folded her hands on the table. Because that day was not important to you at the time. Ethan looked at her. It was important to Emily. Grace nodded. Very. Lily leaned against her father's arm. What happened that day? Grace smiled gently. Your mother brought you to the community center because she wanted you to see something. What? A room full of children drawing. Lily's eyes brightened. I like drawing. You loved it. Grace reached into her purse again and pulled out a small bundle of papers tied with faded blue ribbon. Ethan watched as she placed them on the table. The first page showed a crooked house. The second showed a little girl holding a purple crayon. The third showed 3 people standing beneath a red door. Ethan recognized Lily immediately. He recognized himself too. But the third figure made his breath catch. Emily stood beside them, smiling. And beside Emily was Grace. Your mother started this program, Grace explained. She wanted children from families going through difficult seasons to have a place where they could create things without worrying about grades or expectations. Ethan touched the edge of one drawing. Why did she never tell me? Because she knew you would try to solve it. Ethan frowned. Solve what? Grace looked at him with quiet honesty. Everything. The word landed softly, but Ethan understood it. He had always been that way. When Emily was tired, he found specialists. When Lily struggled at school, he hired tutors. When grief entered their home, he tried to organize it into schedules, routines, and carefully chosen words. He had money, influence, connections, and answers. What he had never learned was how to simply sit beside someone and let the sadness exist. Lily looked through the drawings. This one is mine. She held up a page showing a little girl standing beside a woman with brown hair. Mommy said I should keep drawing even when I felt sad. Grace smiled. She told you that. Lily nodded. She said pictures can remember things for us. Ethan looked at Grace. Why did Emily trust you? Grace took a breath. Because I never asked her for anything. Ethan was silent. That answer was painfully simple. Everyone in his world knew his name, his fortune, and his influence. Grace had known Emily before she knew any of those things about him. She had met the woman behind the billionaire's life. She had seen Emily sitting with children, sharing crayons, laughing quietly, and worrying about whether Lily would grow up remembering kindness. Then Grace placed the final drawing in front of Ethan. It was different from the others. There was no red door, no community center, no mother. Just Ethan and Lily sitting together beneath a large tree. Above them, Lily had written in uneven purple letters, "Daddy is home." Ethan stared at the words. "When did she draw this?" he asked. Grace's voice became softer. "The day Emily told me she was running out of time." Ethan closed his eyes. Lily reached for his hand. "Daddy, why are you crying?" He opened his eyes and looked at his daughter. For years, he had thought protecting Lily meant keeping the painful memories away. Now, sitting beside Grace with Emily's drawings between them, he began to understand something his wife had known long before he did. Sometimes healing does not begin when we forget what hurt us. Sometimes it begins when we finally allow ourselves to remember what was beautiful too. "You knew she was running out of time, and you still never told me?" Ethan asked. Grace did not look away. "She asked me not to." "Why?" "Because she knew you would come looking for answers before you were ready to hear them." Ethan stood slowly from the cafe table and walked toward the rain-streaked window. Outside, Chicago moved beneath a gray evening sky, headlights sliding across wet streets while people hurried beneath umbrellas. 6 years ago, Emily had been planning for a future Ethan believed they would have together. He remembered the appointments, the quiet dinners, the nights when she smiled and told him everything would be fine. He had believed her because believing her was easier than imagining anything else. "What exactly did she tell you?" he asked. Grace opened the cream-colored envelope. "She wrote this for you." Ethan turned around. Grace held the letter carefully, but she did not hand it over yet. "She told me that if you ever found your way back here with Lily, I should give you the letter only after Lily remembered the red door." Ethan looked at his daughter. Lily was sitting quietly beside the drawings, tracing the purple crayon lines with one finger. "Why did she make it so complicated?" Ethan asked. Grace gave him a sad smile. "Because Emily knew you." Ethan almost smiled. "That sounds like her. She said you would try to turn grief into a problem you could solve." Ethan looked down. She was right. Lily reached for his hand. "Daddy, you do that sometimes." Ethan looked at her. "I know." The honesty in those 2 words made Grace lower her eyes. There was no billionaire in that moment. No powerful businessman. No man surrounded by assistants and private offices. There was only a father realizing that his daughter had understood him more clearly than he had understood himself. Grace finally offered him the letter. Ethan took it, but before opening it, he asked, "Why did you keep this for 6 years?" Grace looked toward the rain. "Because I promised Emily. You could have contacted me. I could have. You could have found my office. I could have. You knew where I lived." Grace nodded. "Then why?" Her answer came quietly. "Because Emily asked me to wait until you stopped trying to make Lily forget." Ethan went still. Grace continued. "She told me that after she was gone, you would want to protect your daughter from every painful memory. She said you would pack away her photographs, avoid her favorite songs, and tell Lily only the happiest stories because you would think sadness was dangerous." Ethan looked at the old drawings. His throat tightened. "She knew me too well." "She loved you," Grace said. "There is a difference." Ethan opened the letter. Emily's handwriting filled the first page. He read silently, then stopped. Lily watched his face. "What does Mommy say?" Ethan could not answer immediately. Grace did not ask him to. She simply stayed beside them. Quiet, patient, present. Finally, Ethan whispered, "She says she hopes Lily will grow up knowing that love does not disappear when someone leaves." Lily leaned against him. Ethan closed his eyes. Emily had written that she did not want Lily to remember her only through sadness. She wanted her daughter to remember crayons, rainy afternoons, warm kitchens, silly drawings, and people who showed kindness when nobody was watching. Then Ethan reached the final lines. His expression changed. Grace noticed. "What does it say?" Ethan looked at her. "She wrote your name." Grace became still. Ethan read the sentence again. Emily had not asked Grace to replace her. She had asked her to help Ethan remember that a family could heal without pretending the past never happened. Ethan folded the letter carefully. Lily looked at Grace. "Mommy knew you would find us." Grace's eyes filled with tears. Ethan looked at the napkin in his wallet, then at the woman who had carried Emily's promise for 6 years. For the first time, he wondered whether keeping that little drawing had never been about holding on to the past. Maybe it had been the first quiet invitation to let someone new into their future. "Why did you keep the napkin?" Lily asked. Ethan looked down at the folded paper resting beside Emily's letter. "I thought I was keeping a drawing." Grace watched him quietly. Maybe you were keeping a promise you did not know you had made. Ethan looked at her. What promise? Grace shook her head. That part has to come from you. The cafe had grown almost completely silent. Rain still moved across the windows, but the storm outside no longer seemed important. Ethan unfolded the napkin once more. The little drawing looked almost childlike now, with its uneven lines and purple crayon marks. Yet after everything Grace had revealed, every detail seemed to carry a weight it had never carried before. Lily had drawn herself beside Ethan. Grace stood near them. Emily was barely visible at the edge, almost as if she were watching from a distance. Ethan touched the corner of the paper. I kept this because Lily looked happy. Grace nodded. She had been so quiet for months. I remember. Ethan looked at her sharply. You remember that? Grace lowered her eyes. Emily told me. Ethan stared at the napkin. She never told me she was worried about Lily. Grace answered softly. She did not want you to think you were failing her. Those words opened something inside Ethan that he had kept closed for years. He had built his entire life around being dependable. If Lily needed a doctor, he found the best doctor. If she needed a tutor, he found the best tutor. If she wanted something, he could usually provide it before she finished asking. But there had been one thing he could never give her. Her mother. And because he could not fix that loss, he had tried to make the rest of Lily's world perfect. Grace reached across the table, but stopped before touching him. Emily said you would blame yourself. Ethan gave a quiet laugh that held no humor. She knew me too well. She loved you enough to know your weaknesses. Ethan looked at her. And you? Grace paused. What about me? Why did you stay? Grace seemed surprised by the question. Stay where? In this story. For 6 years. You could have walked away. Grace looked at Lily. Because your daughter remembered me before you did. Lily smiled faintly. I told you I draw people who matter. Grace smiled back. Ethan watched them, and something shifted inside him. He had spent so long believing that letting another person close meant risking another loss. Yet Grace had spent 6 years carrying something precious without asking for money, recognition, or access to his world. She had kept Emily's letter. She had kept Lily's drawings. She had kept a promise that had never benefited her. Ethan reached into his wallet and removed the napkin. He placed it carefully beside the letter. I want to do something, he said. Grace looked at him. What? Go back to the community center. Grace studied his face. Why? Because Lily remembers the red door. He looked at his daughter. And because I think I have spent too many years avoiding places that remind me of Emily. Lily immediately smiled. Can Grace come? Ethan looked at Grace. For a moment, she seemed ready to refuse. Then she saw the quiet hope in Lily's eyes. If your father is willing to let me. Ethan almost smiled. I think I am. The next Saturday morning, they drove through downtown Chicago beneath a pale winter sky. Ethan could have arrived in a luxury vehicle with a driver and an assistant, but he chose to take Lily himself. Grace followed in her own car. When they reached the old community center, the faded red door looked smaller than Ethan remembered. Lily stepped out first. I know this place. Ethan stood beside her. Grace came closer. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Lily reached for both their hands. Ethan looked at Grace, and Grace looked back. No promises were made. No grand declarations. Just 3 people standing beneath an old red door, allowing the past to remain where it belonged while quietly making room for something new. Ethan finally understood why Emily had trusted Grace. She had not asked Grace to save him. She had simply asked her to remind him that love could survive change. And sometimes, the greatest second chance does not arrive with noise. Sometimes it waits quietly behind a door you were once too afraid to open. Daddy, this is where Mommy wanted us to come back. Lily stood beneath the faded red door, holding Ethan's hand with one hand and Grace's with the other. Ethan looked at the old community center and felt something inside him become strangely quiet. 6 years ago, he had walked through this entrance without understanding what Emily had been trying to show him. Now, standing there with Lily and Grace, he finally saw it. Emily had never been building a secret life away from him. She had been building something for the people she loved, quietly and without needing credit. Inside, the center smelled of old books, crayons, coffee, and winter coats drying near the radiator. Grace led them down a narrow hallway toward a small art room. Lily entered first and stopped. I remember this. Along one wall were faded drawings from years ago, preserved in simple frames. Grace pointed toward a corner. You used to sit right there. Lily walked closer. One small picture remained beneath a layer of clear plastic. A crooked house. A purple crayon. 3 figures beneath a red door. Ethan recognized it immediately. That is the first one, Grace said. Ethan looked at her. The first one. Grace nodded. The first picture Emily asked me to keep. Lily stared at it. I made that. You did. Why did Mommy want it? Grace smiled. Because you were happy. Ethan looked at the drawing for a long moment. He finally understood why Emily had cared about something so simple. She had known that one day Lily might forget the exact room, the red door, the smell of crayons, or the sound of her mother's voice. But perhaps she had hoped the feeling would remain. Ethan reached into his wallet and pulled out the newer napkin, the one Lily had drawn at the restaurant. He placed it beside the old picture. The difference was almost painfully beautiful. The first drawing showed Lily with Emily. The newer one showed Lily with Ethan and Grace. One belonged to a family remembering what it had been. The other belonged to a family learning what it could become. Grace looked at Ethan. You do not have to keep it. Ethan looked down at the napkin. I know. Then why will you? He smiled faintly. Because Lily drew it. Lily looked up. And because you were in it, Ethan added. Grace became quiet. Ethan did not reach for her hand. He did not need to. Respect sometimes meant allowing a moment to exist without forcing it to become something else. A few months later, Ethan established a small arts program at the community center in Emily's name, but he made sure Grace had a voice in how it was run. She continued working with children, continued living her own life, and continued reminding Ethan that kindness was not something money could purchase. Lily began drawing again almost every day. One afternoon, she brought her father a new picture. Ethan studied it carefully. Who are these people? Lily smiled. You know who they are. There were 3 figures beneath a bright blue sky. Ethan, Lily, Grace. No one stood at the edge this time. No one was fading into the background. They were simply together. Ethan looked at the empty space where Emily might have been. Where's Mommy? He asked. Lily touched the picture gently. She is still here. Ethan looked confused. Lily smiled. Not in the picture, Daddy. In us. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them and smiled through the tears he no longer tried to hide. That evening, he placed Lily's new drawing beside the old napkin and Emily's letter. He framed all 3 together. The napkin had once been something he kept because he was afraid of losing another memory. Now it became something different. A reminder that love does not always ask us to stay in the past. Sometimes love gives us the grace to carry what mattered, release what we cannot change, and step quietly into a second chance. And beneath the warm light of their home, Ethan finally understood what Emily had known all along. Some things are worth keeping, not because they keep us from moving forward, but because they remind us why we should.